All right, so this presentation is called Birds in the Winter. Again, my name is Jimmy Weebler. I'm an AmeriCorps naturalist here at Nahant Marsh. And we're going to talk about how birds survive the winter. And we're also going to talk about things that you can do to attract a wide variety of birds in the winter to your yard. So how do birds survive the winter? Well, many birds just avoid it altogether. So some birds go to great lengths, pun intended, to beat the winter. And so we're going to talk about a few examples of birds that just avoid winter altogether. This is a range map of the Arctic tern. Now, we don't get Arctic terns in Iowa, but they are one of the longest distance migrants in the terms of birds. And this is a range map. All the green dots you see here at the top, up even into the Arctic Circle, are their breeding areas. So they breed extremely far north, and they travel these red lines along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, and eventually winter in the southern hemisphere at these blue dots here at the bottom. So the Arctic tern really migrates quite a distance in order to beat the winter. And this is another picture of an Arctic tern. They actually have the longest migration known in the animal kingdom. So they travel pole to pole, and they've been documented traveling up to 25,000 miles, and they do that yearly. So just an incredible journey that these birds go on to beat the winter. Another example of a bird that migrates long distance to avoid the winter is the Bartailed Godwit. So we don't have these either in Iowa, but we do have similar species. We have long-billed and short-billed dowitchers and other birds that are related to this shorebird. But the Bartailed Godwit has the longest flight without rest of any other bird. So really, really long distance migrators these are. They travel from Alaska to New Zealand, and they travel about almost 7,000 miles annually. The great snipe is on record for having the fastest long distance flight. So you might have noticed, this picture, they look really similar to woodcocks or Wilson snipe, both of which we have in Iowa and can find in our area in the Quad Cities. We don't have great snipe, but these are the record holders for the fastest long distance flight, where they go from Scandinavia to sub-Saharan Africa, and they fly so fast they get up to 60 miles an hour, and they do that over a span of 4,200 miles. So they're not the fastest bird. They're nowhere near close to peregrine falcon, which can surpass 200 miles an hour. But this is an incredibly fast flight for traveling such a long distance. So not all birds migrate long distance, by the way. This bird here, the Dusky Grouse, or used to be called the blue grouse. There's different species of northern grouse. The Dusky and the Sooty Grouse used to be lumped into the same species called blue grouse, and have since been separated. So the Dusky Grouse holds the record for the shortest bird migration, and this grouse only travels about 3 football field lengths. It's really less about surviving the winter, in that they actually do this migration from the winter to the springtime, and they travel from pine forests in the winter to deciduous woodlands in the spring in order to get a jump on their breeding, and they kind of take advantage of the things that are just coming up in the springtime as part of their food source. But yeah, these hold the record for the shortest migration distance. So those birds beat the winter by migrating, whether it's short-term or long-term migration. And I should mention that a lot of the birds that we actually have in Iowa in winter aren't birds, although we do have them year-round, such as chickadees, black-capped chickadees, northern cardinals, birds like this that we do have in the winter aren't really the birds that you're seeing in the summer. So these are short-distance migrants. The chickadees that we have in the winter, the cardinals that we have in the winter, are birds that are still coming down from northern latitudes and just traveling shorter distance. And so what about the birds, though, that do come here in the winter or do survive the winter? How do they do that? And we're going to talk about several different things that they can do. Some of the physical things that they can do, some obvious, maybe more obvious things, are finding shelter. So birds like owls, woodpeckers, nuthatches, these birds can stay warm by seeking shelter in things like trees or cavities. really any place just to get out of the wind and be insulated from the cold. This helps to insulate them from the cold, but also helps conserve their energy, gets them out of the wind. And it's really a matter of keeping their bodies warmer so that they don't need to expend that energy to heat their bodies up. These are warm-blooded animals, endotherms, we call them, and they need to stay at a constant body temperature in order to do that, to preserve the energy. It's helpful to find shelter. So again, things like owls, woodpeckers, nuthatches make use of this strategy. This is another species of grouse. This is the ruffed grouse. So along the lines of finding insulation and in shelter, some birds can actually tunnel into the snow. So ruffed grouse will literally dive into the snow and create tunnels. And they dive into the snowpack, and they can stay down there for hours, up to days even. And it can be quite warm underneath the insulation of the snow. It can be 25 degrees warmer or more under that snowpack, and that really helps insulate these birds from the cold. But most birds can't do this, but it is one strategy that some birds use. Another strategy that some birds use, so cuddling, this is more a strategy that small mammals use, and it's basically all about reducing your surface area. So we kind of do the same things as humans, right? We, we cross our arms, we might crouch down, tuck your hands under your armpits, that kind of thing. It's all about reducing surface area and reducing the amount of body surface exposed to the air. And there's some birds that can do this. These are tree swallows shown here, but other small birds and maybe even crows sometimes, different species can cuddle together or basically share body heat. And that's another way of conserving that body heat and not just releasing it to the environment. So again, this isn't a common strategy, and it's not a great strategy for surviving the winter, but it can be done in some cases. Another adaptation that birds have of surviving the winter, it may come as no surprise to most people that adding insulation as fat is another option for birds. So adding fat increases insulation. This is a dark-eyed junco shown here, and juncos have been reported to be 14% heavier during the winter time. Chickadees, black-capped chickadees, they keep access to food all winter, and they've been known to eat greater than 35% of their body weight per day. So it's really all about packing on that body fat. That body fat provides an insulation layer. But doing this, it's not a great strategy. It certainly helps birds survive the winter, but it's really limited, the amount of fat that they can add. It's limited by their flight mechanics. Birds can't get too heavy to where they can't fly anymore. And generally, birds add little more body fat than enough to just get through one long cold night. So it's really not a long-term strategy to survive in the winter, adding that fat, but it certainly does help the birds survive. Another option is to either add feathers and or fluffing the feathers out. That can increase the insulation for birds. Goldfinches, redpolls, birds like this can increase their weight by 50% just by adding more feathers. And that fluffing of the feathers, that creates an airspace around the birds, and that airspace warms up and serves as an insulating layer. And that fluffing their feathers can actually reduce thermal conductivity, the rate at which heat is lost in the body, by about half. But even this is barely enough to help a bird survive, a long cold night. So although it does help, it's not the end-all be-all strategy to surviving the winter. If you want the true answer to how birds survive the winter, this is probably the most reliable strategy and the one that's most widely used. So a large majority of birds, they don't use those physical methods to survive the winter, such as finding shelter, digging snow tunnels, adding feathers, but most birds, they need to adjust physiologically. Especially, they're doing these physiological adjustments even at temperatures as high as 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So birds run a little bit hotter than we do. They keep their body temperatures about 100 degrees, more or less. And when the temperature's below that, they need to use their physiology in order to stay at that temperature. And so whenever the temperature drops below, 86 degrees Fahrenheit, no matter how cold it is, birds need to make those physiological adjustments. And especially in the winter, most birds rely almost entirely on shivering to maintain their body temperature. So birds like this crow shown here, they constantly shiver during the winter, especially when they're not generating heat from during flight. So during flight, there's muscle contractions. They're contracting their muscles to move their wings, and those contractions create heat, which helps heat up, maintain their body temperature. But when they're not using those muscles, when they're in stationary phase, they need to shiver in order to. Shivering is a muscle contraction. It's a stationary muscle contraction, and those muscle contractions are what provide the heat to warm up the bird. So shivering is very important for most birds in surviving the winter. Another strategy used is called torpor. So torpor, this is a physiological adjustment whereby birds can lower their body temperature, which in effect lowers their metabolism, and that helps them to conserve the energy and reduce the rate at which they lose heat. So this strategy is very similar to hibernation, except that it's temporary. So the birds in torpor, they physiologically decrease their body temperature, and by lowering their body temperature, they don't need to maintain as high a body temperature, and since they don't need to maintain as high a body temperature, that allows their metabolism to stay lower, and they don't need to burn through as much energy as they would otherwise trying to maintain a higher body temperature. So, like I said, torpor is very similar to hibernation in that they're lowering their body temperature, they're lowering metabolism, but it's a temporary state of inanimation. And chickadees, for example, they can lower their body temperature 10 to 12 degrees during an inactive period, and they can save up to 20% of their energy that would be needed to maintain their stable body temperature. So in effect, they become hypothermic, but it's closely regulated. So again, they use intermittent shivering to closely regulate that hypothermic state. And I have a picture shown here of a ruby-throated hummingbird. Ruby-throated hummingbirds use torpor year-round if needed. So these, as you probably know, hummingbirds, they burn through energy very quick. They're very small animals, and they can't store a lot of energy. And so in order to preserve that energy, they go into a torpor state even during warmer months. So they can use this strategy year-round. So there are other adaptations to surviving the winter. We won't have time to talk about all of them. Those are the kind of the main ones that we talked about here today. But we're going to talk now about what are some things that you can do to help birds survive the winter. And certainly providing food is one thing that you can do to help out. Really, we're going to talk about three main things, and you've probably heard this before, but birds need food, shelter, and water to survive. And it's no different in the wintertime, but they're especially reliant on the food. Food's not as available in winter, and many birds, over 100 species, have been documented using feeder-provided foods. And this is probably black oil sunflower seeds. I would say that this attracts the greatest variety of birds. It's probably your best bang for your buck. It's an inexpensive option, and most birds that eat it, it's not really wasted. So, sometimes you can go out to, wherever and buy mixed bird seeds. They've got the different types of things in there, millet, fruit, nuts, seeds, fillers, and things like that. And if birds are picky, they kind of pick through a lot of that stuff and they just waste it. But black oil sunflower seeds are not generally wasted. And it's a very high energy food that you can provide. And like I said, it's inexpensive, but this, I would say, if you're going to provide any food, this would attract the greatest variety of birds. I put out black oil sunflower seeds in my feeders, and I get, many different species. I get different species of woodpeckers, hairy woodpeckers, downy woodpeckers, red-bellied woodpeckers, tufted titmice, black-capped chickadees, northern cardinals, rose-breasted grosbeaks. Speaking of grosbeaks, there's been a kind of uptick in the number of evening grosbeaks this year in Iowa. Talking to some experts in the field, evening grosbeaks have been in very low numbers, if not absent from documentation in our area for at least the last 8 years. But they've been reported in, the last time I checked, they reported in at least 8 counties, including Scott County, Muscatine County, and evening grosbeaks. If you don't know what they look like, just Google evening grosbeak. They're very pretty grosbeaks, yellow and black colors. But those certainly, could come to a feeder. Jays, blue jays, grackles, red-winged blackbirds, pine siskins, goldfinches, purple finches, house finches, red-breasted nuthatches, white-breasted nuthatches. This year is also another great year for red-breasted nuthatches. I've seen more this year than I have previous years. So these are all different birds that you can attract to your feeder, just providing black oil sunflower seeds. Of course, you can attract some unwanted birds, some invasive species like house sparrows, Eurasian tree sparrows, which are starting to become more numerous in our area, and European starlings, birds like this, can also be attracted to feeders. But that being said, I still think this is probably the best food that you can provide. Another high energy food that you can provide is peanuts, whether they're shelled or deshelled. Shelled peanuts are a little bit easier for the birds to access. They don't have to expend energy to opening the shell, but I think either way, this is still a high energy food that you can provide. Another high energy food, suet cakes. These are really popular to put out. You can actually make these yourselves. There's several different recipes online to making suet cakes, but you can buy these too. They're relatively cheap. And birds like woodpeckers, there's a downy woodpecker shown here on a suet cake inside a cage. But woodpeckers like the downy, titmice, on occasion you might get a brown creeper or maybe even warblers during the migration season might visit a suet cake. So these are another type of food source that is helpful to provide. These are all the different feeder types, and really the more feeders you have out in your yard, the better. And the different types help attract different types of birds. So in order to prevent crowding, it is helpful to provide at least a few feeders. I use this feeder personally on the right hand side, this tube feeder here. I have problems with squirrels, and I do enjoy feeding the squirrels too, but they can make your birdseed go really quickly and make it really expensive for you. So if you are battling squirrels, the Squirrel Buster is a great feeder to use. It is an expensive feeder, I'll warn you, but I guess you kind of make your money back by saving some of that food back for the birds. But tube feeders in general, you don't have to get the Squirrel Buster. There's different types of tube feeders, but this is probably the most common feeder and is going to attract and host probably the most wide variety of birds. All the birds I mentioned that you can get with black oil sunflower seeds, I've gotten on my personal feeder, providing a feeder just like this, just a general tube feeder. And I guess what's nice about the tube feeder, the way it deters squirrels, if folks who aren't familiar, the ring that goes around the bottom that these birds are perched on is on a spring. So if something heavy, and you can set the tension of the spring to deter, even larger birds like blue jays and grackles if you don't want those. But the spring, if something heavy such as a squirrel gets onto this ring here, it pulls the bottom down and it shuts off these ports, access to the food. So that's how it deters the squirrels. But tube feeders are great. We mentioned suet feeders before. Thistle feeders are common for goldfinches, red poles, pine siskins. You can put thistle seed, believe it or not, in these tubes, and they have really tiny access ports. So only birds with smaller bills that can get that thistle seed out of there can eat that. So those are very popular for the finches. Hopper feeders are great for larger birds if you do want to attract those blue jays, grackles, red-winged blackbirds, and things like that. These are great. This one's set up to even provide suet cakes on the side. Have that option. There are specialized feeders that provide peanuts here. So we see the woodpeckers here on a peanut feeder. Ground feeders are a good option because there are several birds, dark-eyed juncos, several different types of sparrows, towhees, goldfinches, cardinals, doves, mourning doves. Those all prefer ground feeding. So if you can provide some kind of platform, usually it's raised up a little bit and has a screen at the bottom, which you can't really see here, but the screen kind of allows the seed to keep dry. You don't want the seed getting wet and moldy, but by keeping it dry and really keeping bird feces out of it, having that screen there helps. On the bottom, this screen here, so this metal cage, I guess is a better word for it. The reason I showed this picture is because that might be helpful. When you provide ground feeders, you're really opening up the opportunity for feral cats to snack on your birds. Feral cats are extremely good at catching songbirds and are quite a problem really all over the United States. So maybe having a cage like that isn't a bad idea to help deter cats. But if you do have a ground feeder, it also, if you put it out away from the brush, even though the birds like that brush to hang in, they feel safe in that cover. Providing the ground feeder away from cover helps prevent cats from capturing your birds. But like I said, ground feeders are really good for some of those more specialized ground feeders, like the sparrows and doves. So that's kind of all about providing food. So let's talk about water really quickly. Water is just as important in the winter as it is in the summer, except water can be hard to access in the winter for birds if it's frozen. So providing a bird bath is a great option. They do make bird baths that are heated. You can just plug the bird bath in and it keeps the water unfrozen. However, those can be pricey. You can buy, I think a cheaper option is to buy a submersion heater or a de-icer. That just goes right into, you just place it right into the water, the cord hangs out and you plug it in, and that can keep the water defrosted and allow the birds to access it. You can use no heater at all. Maybe you just replace the water daily. I've heard of folks using like terracotta saucer dishes and just swapping it out. You might want to get like a heavy duty one that doesn't crack on you, but you can just swap those out daily and keep the water fresh. Really, it's a good thing anyways, because keeping the water fresh is important. But you can also use DIY options. If folks have heated dog bowls, can also work as a bird bath. But there are other DIY options out there you can look up online. I wanted to mention it is important to have a ground fault circuit interrupter outlet. Those outlets, with the test reset buttons. It's, with the weather and everything, it's important you don't want to, fry your wires or anything. So having an outlet like that is usually important if you're going to be plugging things in, especially water related outside. And like I said, keep it clean. Birds need clean water in order to stay healthy. So changing the water, at least daily or every other day is useful. So as far as shelter goes, birds need shelter. And other than, putting out nesting boxes or shelter boxes, really you can just plant native trees and shrubs to serve as cover. So there's some research emerging in relatively recent research, actually. I've got a paper here I want to quote here in a minute from 2018. But recent research is showing that native trees are more beneficial to birds, and in fact, very important to birds, native birds, and that invasive trees and shrubs don't support the insects that are needed by a lot of birds that rely on those native insects. So if there's invasive trees and shrubs in your yard, those could be not as beneficial or may not host as many insects that are important to some of the birds that you want to attract to your yard. So planting native is important. This study was in 2018 in a prestigious science journal, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And this is a quote from the abstract. Our results demonstrate that non-native plants reduce habitat quality for insectivorous birds, and restoration of human-dominated areas should prioritize native plants to support local food webs. So that was a quote straight out of their abstract. Very new science in a very prestigious journal, peer-reviewed scientific journal. And I don't think that can be stated enough, that planting native and replacing invasives is important to our local ecosystems. I wanted to give you some examples of what kind of native plants can you buy, or where do you buy the plants in the first place. You can visit Iowa State Forest Nursery online. They have plants for sale, native plants. That's a good site. Prairie Moon Nursery is another good one. We use that here in the Ant Marsh sometimes to purchase native seed. To Iowa, Guardians of the Forest and Prairie, sometimes you can find them on Facebook. They offer local plant sales. These are just a few options to look up and see what kind of native plants are available. So what kind of plants can you plant? Fruit-bearing native trees. Eastern red cedar is a good evergreen option if you don't want a deciduous tree. But mulberries, hackberries, black cherries, different types of dogwoods, rough-leaf dogwood, gray dogwood. This doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of native trees, but these are some common ones that can support birds. Also native shrubs and vines. Black raspberries are good. Wild grape, smooth sumac, elderberry. Again, barely scratching the surface here, but these are some examples of some native shrubs that you could plant to support birds, and not only birds, but other local wildlife. And I'll just leave you with this slide. Keep it dirty. So leave the leaves out there. Leaves are important for insects overwintering. So by keeping those leaves out in your yard, although it does look dirty, it's important for the wildlife out there. Insects really need that. Moths and caterpillars and other types of beetles and things like that overwinter in a dormant state inside the duff layer, the leaves on the ground. So by leaving those, you're leaving those for other wildlife to consume. And just something as simple as leaving a brush pile or forest debris, just leaving that out in the open. Brush piles are great cover for birds to find refuge, from things like feral cats and other predators, raccoons and things that may want to eat them. So keep it dirty, and you should be able to attract more birds to your yard. So hopefully folks found that helpful. Again, if you guys have questions, please drop it down in the chat box and I will answer those. So this is a message from John. He said, I put a timer on my water heater so it's not on all night. That's a great option, save some energy. Certainly if it's not gonna be getting too terribly cold overnight, then yeah, putting a timer on is a great option. Axel asked, how long does a torpor state last? That depends on how cold it is and on the species of bird and things like that, but birds can stay in torpor from several hours to several days even. But it definitely depends on what the temperature is and kind of what the environmental factors are. So thanks, Paul. I appreciate the kind words. Are there any structures that can be placed to help out with shelter? So I think just simply leaving brush piles out in your yard can provide shelter for birds. That's a very good go-to. As far as like man-made structures, I think nesting boxes still work. You might have trouble, keeping the house sparrows out of those, but boxes are good. But I think just providing native plants and brush piles and things like that are what birds naturally find as cover in nature. Is holly bush a native plant, and do the birds eat the berries? I don't think so. I don't know the species name. I don't think holly bush is a native, but I would have to look that one up. I'm not sure. But as far as like berry producing shrubs go, as far as invasive ones, honeysuckle is a terrible one. Bush honeysuckle is a invasive that's terrible for our woodlands. It outshades and outcompetes a lot of native plants. Birds do eat the berries. They don't get as much nutrition from them. So I guess that's a good point. And in addition to invasive plants not providing the insect life, they also produce less nutritious berries. So honeysuckle is poor nutrition, but birds eat it and they spread those berries by pooping everywhere, and that's how that invasive spreads everywhere. But a native alternative to that would be maybe elderberries is a good shrub to plant that would offer berries. Oriental bittersweet is a really nice vine that gives good berries. And I don't know that anyone would want to plant this in their yard, but poison ivy has nutritious berries as well. I certainly wouldn't want to plant it in my yard, but poison ivy is good for the wildlife and it offers nutritious berries. Should birds be fed year round, or is it better for the birds to let them fend for themselves during certain times of the year? I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that feeding birds in the summer is detrimental to their fitness. And I would argue that birds are more reliant on our help during the winter. So if, to kind of save your wallet a little bit, if you were going to feed them at a certain time of the year, I would feed them in winter or during migration months as well. But I don't think that, feeding them year round isn't necessarily a bad thing. And I've heard different things about, especially with ruby-throated hummingbirds, how long do you leave out the nectar there for them, the sugar solution. Some people claim that leaving that nectar out too long encourages the hummingbirds to stay longer and therefore, be at risk of those cold temperatures that could hurt them. But I've also heard from experts the other way around. So have to do more digging and research on that. But as far as feeding birds, black oil sunflower seeds year round, if you can afford it, I'd say go for it. Thanks, Mary. Appreciate the kind words. Where do various birds sleep? Usually in cover. They tend to take refuge in cover and just sleep, whether that's in trees or shrubs or in a brush pile, something like that. That's where birds sleep. They tend to not sleep out in the open as far as I'm aware. Paul said he thinks holly is native. Don't know the Latin name, but sounds like holly is a native plant. So thanks, Paul. Appreciate that. Cracked corn is a good feed for bird. That's a good one I didn't mention. So thank you to whoever suggested that. Cracked corn, another good option. That'd be really good for pheasants and the doves and birds like that. Can certainly make use of that cracked corn as well. That was the last question. So again, I appreciate everyone for joining me today. I hope you all took something away from this. And again, if you're able to donate, we appreciate goodwill donations. And stay tuned for more webinars. We're looking to offer these at least once a month. So hopefully seeing some of you soon. So thanks again.